6 months ago, my wife almost lost her only way to leave the house. The HOA president ordered a tow truck to her van. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, phones already recording. My wife just smiled and said, "Go ahead." Something in her calm made the tow driver hesitate. Across the street, the HOA president's smile started cracking. 10 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser turned the corner. For her, not us. My name is Daniel Reyes, and my wife Sarah has used a wheelchair since a car accident 4 years ago. We bought our house in Willow Creek Estates because the listing promised accessible parking guaranteed. That promise turned out to be worth exactly nothing once Deborah Voss became HOA president. Sarah teaches piano lessons from home, and our reserved accessible spot near our driveway meant she could load her van without help. It was small, but it was ours. We paid dues on time, followed every rule, and never imagined a parking spot could become a battlefield with a woman none of us had voted for twice. Deborah took over as HOA president after the previous board quietly resigned, citing personal reasons nobody would explain further. Within weeks, laminated warning notices appeared on cars for imaginary violations. A trash can left out an hour too long. A wreath deemed too seasonal. People muttered, but nobody wanted to be her next target. The first time she noticed our van, she circled it twice, clipboard in hand, before knocking on our door. "This spot isn't marked correctly on my updated map," she said, holding up a printout with our house crossed out in red pen. I told her we'd had this spot since closing. She just smiled and walked away. A week later, a new sign appeared near our driveway, reserved for resident use only, no permit parking. Our official accessible placard, issued by the county, apparently didn't count in her private rulebook. When I called the HOA office, the assistant sighed and said, "Deborah handles all the parking changes personally now." Sarah brushed it off at first. "She's probably just disorganized," she said, though I noticed her double-checking the placard was visible every single morning after that. I didn't tell her about the way Deborah had stared at our van from her porch the day before, arms crossed, like she was building a case file in her head. Other neighbors started warning us quietly. Mrs. said Deborah had once had her grandson's bike confiscated for blocking a sidewalk that wasn't even on our street. A retired teacher 2 houses down said he stopped attending HOA meetings because disagreeing with Deborah got you labeled difficult in the community newsletter. I finally attended a board meeting myself, hoping reason would work. Deborah ran it like a courtroom, cutting people off mid-sentence, reminding everyone she'd built this community from nothing. When I raised the parking sign issue, she said accessible spots were a privilege granted by the board, not a legal right. Nobody corrected her. That night Sarah looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with her disability. "I just want to park my van without an argument," she said. I promised her I'd handle it. I didn't know yet that handling Deborah Voss meant stepping into a fight that had been building long before we ever moved in. I emailed the HOA management company directly, attaching a photo of Sarah's state-issued placard and the ADA accessibility clause buried in our covenant documents. The reply came from Deborah herself, not the company. "I'll take this under advisement," she wrote, followed by a line reminding me that HOA fines could apply to unauthorized communications with vendors. A neighbor named Priya pulled me aside at the mailbox. "She did this to the Hendersons 2 years ago," she whispered. "Their disabled son's ramp got flagged as an unapproved structure. They moved out within the year. I asked why nobody reported her to the county. Priya just shook her head and walked faster. I started documenting everything, every notice, every sign change, every date. Sarah thought I was being paranoid. "She's just a difficult woman who likes control," she said. I didn't argue, but something about the pattern felt less like control and more like a plan. One small notice building toward something bigger. Deborah began appearing at odd hours, walking her small dog past our house slower than any dog needed to walk. She'd glance at the van, then at her phone, typing notes. One evening she stopped at our mailbox and said, cheerfully, "You know, accessible spots do come up for board review sometimes." It wasn't a threat. The mysterious review happened faster than expected. A letter arrived citing a supposed resident complaint that our accessible spot was unfairly monopolizing a shared driveway easement. I asked the HOA office who filed the complaint. They said the name was confidential. Deborah, coincidentally, had access to every resident's contact information as president. Sarah decided to attend the next meeting herself, wheeling up to the podium with the county-issued placard in hand. Deborah barely glanced at it. "Placards are a state matter, not an HOA matter," she said smoothly. "And this board reserves final say over community parking layout." A few residents shifted uncomfortably, but nobody objected out loud. After the meeting, an older man named Walt caught up with us in the parking lot. "She pulled something like this on a veteran 2 streets over," he said quietly. "Guy had a service dog. She called it excessive pet activity until he finally sold his house." I asked why nobody had stopped her. He just shrugged. Tired. That night I searched old community newsletters online and found Deborah's name attached to at least 4 other parking disputes over the past 3 years, each one involving a resident with a disability or medical need. It wasn't random enforcement. It was a pattern, and we had just become her newest project. I brought the pattern to Sarah, laying out names and dates on our kitchen table. She stared at it a long moment before saying, "So this isn't about our spot at all. It's about her." I nodded. Somehow that realization made it worse. We weren't dealing with confusion. We were dealing with something deliberate. The following week, a fresh notice arrived. Our accessible spot was being temporarily reassigned for a supposed drainage inspection. No inspection ever happened. Instead, an unfamiliar car began parking there daily, a car Priya later recognized as belonging to Deborah's adult son, who didn't even live in the neighborhood. I photographed the son's car parked in Sarah's spot 3 mornings in a row and sent the images to the HOA management company, CCING Deborah directly. Her response came within the hour. Terse and clipped, "Board decisions are not subject to resident appeal." No explanation for why a non-resident vehicle occupied an ADA spot. Sarah's frustration finally cracked through her usual patience. "I paid for this house. I have a legal placard," she said, voice steady but eyes glassy. I held her hand and promised we'd fight it properly. County code enforcement, fair housing complaints, whatever it took. She just nodded, exhausted. That weekend, Deborah hosted her infamous community coffee, where she held court on her porch while neighbors nervously nodded along to her latest rules. I watched from our driveway as she gestured toward our house mid-sentence, other residents glancing over. Whatever she was building, it was clear we were now the main topic. The real spark came on a Tuesday morning. Sarah had a piano student waiting, her wheelchair lift halfway down, when Deborah marched over holding a bright orange notice. "This vehicle is in violation of updated parking policy," she announced loudly enough for the whole cul-de-sac to hear, slapping the paper against the windshield. "What violation?" Sarah asked, calm despite the humiliation of neighbors peering from windows. Deborah pointed to a policy number that didn't exist in any document we'd ever received. "Effective immediately," she said. "Unauthorized vehicles in reassigned spots will be towed at owner's expense." She turned and walked away before Sarah could respond. I rushed home from work after Sarah's panicked call. By the time I arrived, a tow truck was already idling at the curb, its driver reading paperwork Deborah had handed him personally. "Ma'am says this spot's been reassigned for weeks," he said, shrugging like it was routine. Sarah simply repeated, "This is an ADA-designated space." Deborah stood on her porch, arms folded, watching the scene like a director pleased with her own production. A small crowd formed, Priya, Walt, even the mail carrier pausing mid-route. I asked Deborah for the official reassignment paperwork. She smiled thinly and said, "I don't answer to residents' demands." Daniel, the tow driver, to his credit, looked between the disability placard, the state registration, and Deborah's handwritten note, clearly uneasy. "Ma'am, this placard looks legit to me," he said. Deborah snapped back, "It doesn't matter. County placards don't override HOA covenants." Her voice had risen just enough that neighbors began recording on their phones. Sarah, still remarkably composed, pulled up the county DMV disability parking statute on her phone and read it aloud for everyone to hear, especially the part where interfering with an accessible placard violated state law. Deborah's jaw tightened. "This is a private community," she snapped. "State law is a suggestion here, not a rule." That single sentence, "State law is a suggestion here," got captured clearly on 3 different phones. I saw Deborah notice the cameras for the first time, her confidence flickering, just for a second, before she straightened her shoulders and doubled down instead of backing off, telling the driver to proceed with the tow. The tow driver hesitated, glancing at the gathering crowd, then at Deborah, then at his hitch already halfway under the van's frame. "I need this in writing before I touch a disability vehicle," he finally said. Deborah pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, apparently drafting an authorization on the spot. While she typed, Walt quietly dialed a number and stepped away from the group. I didn't think much of it then. I assumed he was calling another neighbor. What I didn't know yet was that Walt had a nephew in the county sheriff's office, and he'd just described exactly what was happening in real time. Deborah handed the driver a printed authorization with the HOA letterhead, her signature scrawled at the bottom. The driver read it twice, uncertain. "This still doesn't override a state placard." "Ma'am," he said. Deborah's voice sharpened. "I'll take full legal responsibility. Hook it up." Reluctantly, moved toward the front axle. Sarah, hands steady on her wheelchair armrests, looked directly at Deborah and said, "You understand this is being recorded, and that towing an ADA vehicle without valid cause is a civil rights violation, right?" Deborah's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, something like doubt crossed her face before she covered it with irritation. "I've dealt with entitled residents before," Deborah snapped, loud enough for the growing crowd. "This community has rules, and rules apply to everyone." Priya, standing near her mailbox, muttered just loud enough to be heard. Rules apply to everyone except your son's illegally parked car. A few neighbors laughed under their breath. Deborah spun toward Priya, finger pointing. That's a completely different matter. But the damage was done. Several neighbors were now openly filming, whispering to each other about the son's car, about the Hendersons, about every quiet grievance they'd swallowed for years finally bubbling to the surface in front of witnesses. The tow driver's radio crackled. His dispatcher was asking for updated authorization documentation before proceeding on any ADA-flagged vehicle. Standard company policy after a recent lawsuit elsewhere. Deborah's face went pale for a moment. "This is ridiculous," she said, though her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Ma'am, company policy is company policy," the driver said, unhooking the chain from beneath the van. "I can't tow this without a county-verified order, not just an HOA letter." Deborah's carefully built authority, so effective in board meetings, suddenly meant nothing in front of an outside professional with his own rules to follow. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the driver climbed back into his truck. Deborah tried to salvage the moment. "This isn't over," she said towards Sarah. "I'll have the board issue a formal violation instead." Sarah simply replied, "Please do. I'd love to see that in writing, with your signature on it." As the tow truck pulled away empty, Deborah turned to face the neighbors still watching. "Show's over," she announced, forcing brightness into her voice. But nobody moved right away. For the first time since she'd taken office, the crowd wasn't nodding along. They were exchanging glances, quietly recalculating what they'd tolerated for years. That evening, our phone buzzed with messages from neighbors we'd barely spoken to before. Some sent apologies for staying silent. Others sent screenshots of old HOA emails where Deborah had made similarly baseless threats. It felt less like sympathy and more like a dam quietly starting to crack open, one message at a time. Sarah sat at the kitchen table that night, replaying the video Priya had sent her. "She really thought she could just tow my van in front of everyone," she said, shaking her head. "I noticed something else in the footage," Deborah checking her phone nervously right after the driver mentioned company policy, as if worried about who might see it. "I didn't sleep much that night, thinking about the sheer confidence it took for someone to attempt what Deborah had tried. It wasn't impulsive. The letterhead, the printed authorization, all of it looked pre-prepared. Somehow, I suspected this wasn't her first attempt to bend the rules for something bigger than a parking spot." The next morning, an official HOA violation letter appeared in our mailbox, dated the day before, clearly drafted in advance of the confrontation. It cited unauthorized vehicle obstruction and threatened a $500 fine plus daily penalties. Sarah read it twice, laughing bitterly.
"She wrote this before."
I called the HOA management company again, this time asking directly whether Deborah had authority to unilaterally reassign ADA-designated parking. The representative paused before answering carefully. "Technically, no board member has unilateral authority over accessibility compliance. That requires a documented vote." I asked if such a vote had ever happened. Silence followed. Armed with that admission, I requested official board meeting minutes for the past year. The management company said requests had to go through Deborah's office first. Of course they did. That she'd built a system where every complaint about her had to pass through her own hands first. Deborah didn't wait for us to escalate. Within days, New violations started appearing across the street from Priya and Walt's houses too, the two neighbors who had spoken up during the confrontation. Suddenly their trash bins were improperly stored, and their landscaping was non-compliant, despite years of no complaints before. Priya called me furious. "She's punishing us for what we said," she said. "This is retaliation." I agreed, though I also recognized the strategy: isolate the dissenters, make an example of them, and hope fear would silence the rest of the neighborhood before this went any further. It was working. Slowly, at the next mailbox gathering, fewer people made eye contact with us. A few families who'd previously nodded along with sympathy now avoided the topic entirely, worried about drawing Deborah's attention. Only Walt and Priya remained openly vocal, and even they started double-checking their yards obsessively, afraid of the next flagged violation. I decided to file a formal complaint with the county's Fair Housing Office, attaching photos, the violation letter, and video of the attempted tow. The intake specialist told me these cases could take weeks to investigate, but confirmed that interfering with ADA parking access could constitute a housing discrimination violation under both state and federal law. Meanwhile, Deborah escalated her campaign in the HOA newsletter, writing a vague but pointed piece about residents who exploit accessibility rules for personal convenience. She never named us directly, but everyone in the cul-de-sac knew exactly who she meant. Sarah read it silently, then said, "She's rewriting the story before we can tell ours." Sarah began keeping her own folder, every text from sympathetic neighbors, every screenshot, every date. "If she wants a paper trail," she said, "I'll build one too." I admired her calm through all of it, though I could see the toll it took. The way she double-checked the placard every morning like a small ritual of self-defense. A week later, Deborah scheduled an emergency board meeting specifically to review accessibility parking policy community-wide. It felt less like policy review and more like a stage for her to publicly justify what had already happened, hoping to rally enough support before word of the tow attempt spread beyond our small corner of the neighborhood. The meeting room was packed. More residents than I'd ever seen attend before. Deborah stood at the podium, composed and polished, presenting slides about community harmony and fair enforcement. She never once mentioned the tow truck, the son's car, or the retaliatory violations against Priya and Walt. It was a performance, not an explanation. When public comment opened, Sarah wheeled to the front and calmly recounted what had happened. Video evidence queued up on a laptop for the room to see. The footage played Deborah's own words back to her. "State law is a suggestion here," echoing through a silent room full of neighbors' faces. Deborah's composure cracked slightly as murmurs spread through the crowd. "That footage is taken out of context," she insisted, though nobody could imagine what context justified those exact words. A woman near the back, someone we'd never spoken to before, stood up and said, "She did something almost identical to my mother 2 years ago." One story became 2, then 3. A young father described how Deborah had targeted his family's ramp installation as an unapproved structure, the same month his daughter started needing it. Each testimony added another data point to a pattern that suddenly felt undeniable. No longer isolated incidents, but a documented history of targeting disabled residents. Deborah tried to regain control, banging her gavel for order, insisting these were unrelated matters being weaponized against her leadership. But something had shifted in the room. The fear that once kept people quiet was giving way to something sturdier. Collective frustration finally finding a shared, undeniable voice among the residents present. The board secretary, a quiet woman named Fran who rarely spoke publicly, asked to review the original vote authorizing the accessibility parking policy Deborah kept citing. Deborah hesitated, then claimed the records were being digitized and unavailable that night. Fran's raised eyebrow suggested she didn't believe that excuse for a second. After the meeting, Fran approached us in the parking lot, glancing over her shoulder before speaking. "I've been on this board 3 years," she said quietly. "I've never seen a vote on ADA parking reassignment." She's been making these calls unilaterally the whole time. It was the first real confirmation from inside the board itself. Fran agreed to help, cautiously, saying she'd start pulling whatever records she still had access to before Deborah could quietly remove them. I thanked her, though I understood the risk she was taking. Going against Deborah publicly hadn't gone well for anyone else in this neighborhood so far, and she knew it too. That night, Sarah and I sat on our porch longer than usual, watching the quiet street. "It's strange," she said. "A month ago I just wanted to park my van in peace. Now we're basically building a case." I squeezed her hand. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about one parking spot. 2 days later, unmarked official notices appeared on Fran's car too, first time in her 3 years on the board. The message was clear. Even if unspoken, cooperate with us, and you become a target next. Fran texted me a photo of the notice with one line, "She knows I talked to you," rather than back down. Fran doubled her efforts, quietly photographing old HOA filing cabinets before Deborah could clear them out. She found something unexpected buried in a folder labeled Maintenance Reserve. Invoices for landscaping work dated to weekends when the entire crew, according to their own public schedule, hadn't been working at all. Fran forwarded the invoices to me with a short note. "This might be bigger than parking." I stared at the numbers a long time. Several $1,000s paid out over 18 months for services that, according to neighbors, never actually happened. Suddenly, the aggressive parking enforcement made a different kind of sense. If Deborah controlled every complaint channel, every board vote, every piece of paperwork, she also controlled how HOA reserve funds got approved and spent. Harassing disabled residents into moving out, I realized with a chill, might not just be about ego, it might be about clearing out anyone likely to ask financial questions. I brought this theory to Priya and Walt during a quiet evening at Walt's kitchen table. Walt, still sharp despite his age, nodded slowly. "The Hendersons started asking about reserve fund statements right before their ramp got flagged," he said. "I never connected it until now, but that timing wasn't a coincidence." Priya pulled up her own old emails, searching for anything similar. She found a message from 18 months ago where she'd casually asked about a special maintenance assessment fee. 2 weeks later, her trash bins were suddenly improperly stored, for the first time in 4 years of living there without a single complaint. The pattern crystallized painfully clear. Anyone who questioned Deborah's spending got quietly punished under the guise of minor code violations, while anyone with a legitimate accessibility need became an especially convenient target. Since disability complaints were harder for outsiders to publicly challenge without looking cruel or dismissive toward a vulnerable resident, we decided our next move needed to be careful, not emotional. Fran suggested requesting a formal financial audit through the county, something Deborah couldn't simply deny or delay through her usual office gatekeeping. I filed the request that week, citing the suspicious invoices and the pattern of retaliation against residents who asked questions. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than any of us expected. Suddenly people who'd stayed silent for years started sharing their own stories. A fence dispute here, a landscaping fine there, always following a moment when someone had questioned Deborah's decisions or spending too directly for her comfort. Deborah, sensing the shifting mood, tried a new approach entirely, sudden friendliness. She waved at Sarah from her porch, complimented our lawn, even mentioned reconsidering the accessibility policy at the next meeting. Sarah remained polite but wary. "She's not backing down," Sarah told me later. "She's just changing tactics." That instinct proved right within days. A new resident, someone Deborah had personally recruited to join the board months earlier, began publicly defending her online, dismissing the growing accusations as a few disgruntled neighbors with personal vendettas. The community Facebook group turned into a quiet battlefield of screenshots and counter-screenshots almost overnight. For a short while, things went strangely quiet. No new violation notices arrived. Deborah stopped walking past our house at odd hours. Even the community newsletter skipped its usual pointed commentary. Sarah, cautiously relieved, said, "Maybe she realized she overreached." I wanted to believe that too, but something about the silence felt deliberate. Friend warned us not to relax. "She's not the type to just give up," she said during a quiet phone call. "She's regrouping." I trusted her instincts more than my own optimism at that point, given how accurately she'd predicted Deborah's retaliation against her own car just weeks earlier. The county's Fair Housing Office confirmed they'd opened a formal file on our complaint, though the investigator warned these cases moved slowly, sometimes months before any real action. Sarah sighed at the timeline. Months of just waiting, hoping she doesn't try something else in the meantime, she said, tired but still determined. Meanwhile, the financial audit request I'd filed made its way to the county's HOA Oversight Division. A small department friend said rarely got involved unless multiple residents corroborated the same complaint pattern. With Fran, Priya, Walt, and now several other families willing to speak up, that corroboration finally existed on paper. Sarah started teaching her piano lessons again without interruption for the first time in weeks. Students arriving and leaving without a single lecture from Deborah about reassigned spots. For a few days, our little corner of Willow Creek Estates almost felt normal again, though none of us fully trusted it to last. I used the quiet stretch to organize everything methodically. A timeline of every notice, every conversation, every neighbor's testimony, cross-referenced with dates from the suspicious invoices Fran had found. Laid out together, the pattern read less like neighborhood drama and more like a small-scale abuse of power, sustained through fear. Walt mentioned offhand one afternoon that his nephew, the deputy, had asked a few informal questions about that HOA situation during a family dinner. Nothing official yet, he clarified, just curiosity after hearing Walt's account of the attempted tow. Still, planted a small, hopeful seed that outside eyes were paying attention. Priya's daughter, a college student home for the summer, offered to help organize everything into a shareable document, complete with dates, screenshots, and video timestamps. "If this goes to the county or the news, you'll want it clean," she said. Her practical energy felt like a small gift during an exhausting stretch. Fran quietly confirmed something else during a follow-up call. The resident complaint that had originally flagged our accessible spot for review had no corroborating signature or contact information on file. despite HOA policy requiring both. In other words, the complaint Deborah cited as her justification may never have actually existed at all. That detail hit differently than everything else. If true, it meant the entire confrontation, the tow truck, the fine, the public humiliation, had been built on a complaint Deborah likely fabricated herself, using her position to manufacture a justification for targeting Sarah's van from the very beginning of this ordeal. I asked Fran if she could get written confirmation of the missing signature from the management company. She said she'd try, though she warned Deborah had recently requested temporary restricted access to certain files, citing vague privacy concerns. It felt like watching someone quietly try to bury evidence before anyone noticed it was missing. Despite the quiet week, Sarah admitted she still flinched slightly every time she backed her van into our driveway, half expecting another notice or another confrontation waiting for her. "I hate that she's made me feel like a guest in my own neighborhood," she said one evening, voice quiet but steady with frustration. I promised her this wouldn't last forever, though privately I worried the county process could drag on far longer than either of us wanted. Still, with Fran, Priya, Walt, and a growing chorus of neighbors finally speaking openly, the quiet stretch felt less like retreat and more like the calm before real consequences. The calm broke the following Monday. Deborah called another emergency meeting, this time announcing a sweeping new HOA bylaw amendment giving the board expanded authority to manage accessibility accommodations. On a case-by-case basis, conveniently timed just as the county investigation into her original policy began gaining momentum among residents and officials alike. Fran later confirmed the amendment had never gone through the required resident vote, buried instead in a consent agenda most people skimmed past without reading closely. "She's trying to retroactively legalize what she already did," Fran said, disbelief in her voice at the sheer boldness of the maneuver. Armed with this new authority, Deborah issued a formal notice declaring our original accessible parking arrangement under review pending compliance verification,
effectively freezing Sarah's guaranteed spot in legal limbo while the investigation into Deborah herself was still unfolding. A move that felt less like coincidence and more like calculated retaliation.
Sarah read the notice twice before setting it down carefully. "She's using the rules against the very people asking questions about the rules," she said. It was almost impressive in its audacity, using bureaucracy as both shield and weapon, daring anyone to untangle the mess fast enough to stop her next move. I contacted our fair housing investigator immediately, forwarding the new bylaw amendment and its suspicious timing. The investigator's tone shifted noticeably, from cautious to genuinely concerned. "Retaliation during an open investigation is taken very seriously," she said, promising to expedite certain aspects of our case given this new development. Meanwhile, Deborah escalated her public messaging, framing the entire situation as residents attacking a volunteer leader for simply trying to maintain order. A surprising number of newer residents, unfamiliar with her history, began echoing this narrative online, creating an uncomfortable split within the community between longtime residents and newer arrivals. Priya's daughter noticed something odd while monitoring the community Facebook group. Several accounts defending Deborah most aggressively had been created only recently, with almost no other posting history. "These might not even be real neighbors," she said, screenshotting profiles for the growing folder of evidence we'd been building together. Fran, still quietly working from inside the board, discovered that 2 of those defensive accounts matched email addresses used to register for HOA events under Deborah's own household. It appeared she wasn't just controlling the narrative through intimidation anymore. She was manufacturing artificial support using fake or borrowed identities online. The revelation, once confirmed, felt like another twist layered onto an already tangled situation. Deborah wasn't simply a difficult HOA president overreacting to a parking dispute. She was actively engineering a coordinated defense, using fabricated complaints, fabricated online support, and now retroactive bylaws, each piece building toward protecting something bigger than her ego. Sarah, exhausted but resolute, began attending every meeting despite the emotional toll, determined not to let Deborah's narrative go unanswered. If she wants a fight in public, she'll get one, Sarah said, though I could see the fatigue behind her determination growing heavier with each passing confrontation. At the next meeting, Deborah attempted to push through a vote formalizing her earlier bylaw change, likely hoping momentum from her online support would carry it. Instead, Fran calmly presented the missing signature issue on the original complaint, along with the newly discovered fake account pattern, live in front of the entire board. The room went silent in a way it hadn't during any previous confrontation. Even some of Deborah's usual allies on the board exchanged uneasy glances. One board member, an older man named Gerald who rarely spoke, finally asked the question hanging in the air. Deborah, did you write that original complaint yourself? Deborah's composure, so carefully maintained through every previous confrontation, faltered visibly for the first time. I don't have to answer baseless accusations, she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument, as though the entire room already suspected the answer. Gerald pressed further, asking for the original complaint's documentation to be pulled immediately for board review. Deborah claimed, once again, that records were unavailable due to a system migration, an excuse that had now been used so many times it barely registered as believable to anyone still listening closely in that room. After the meeting, Gerald approached Fran privately, admitting he'd had his own doubts about Deborah for over a year but stayed quiet, worried about becoming her next target. I should have spoken up sooner, he said. Fran told him it wasn't too late, especially with the county investigation already gaining real traction. With Gerald now willing to corroborate concerns internally, the board's dynamic shifted noticeably. For the first time, Deborah found herself outnumbered in private conversations, no longer able to rely on unanimous silence to push her decisions through without meaningful pushback from people who actually understood the community's history. Sensing the shifting ground beneath her, Deborah tried a more aggressive tactic, personally visiting several newer residents to build direct loyalty outside official channels. She framed the growing scrutiny as jealous longtime residents resisting positive change, a narrative that worked on a few people unfamiliar with the community's actual recent history. One of those newer residents, a young couple with a baby, later told Priya they'd felt uneasy about Deborah's visit, but hadn't known who else to trust yet. Priya gently shared our documented timeline with them, and within days, the couple quietly withdrew their earlier public support online. Slowly, methodically, the artificial coalition Deborah had built began eroding as more residents gained access to the actual documented history rather than her curated version of events. Even people who'd previously stayed neutral out of caution started reaching out privately, offering small pieces of information they'd witnessed over the years. A woman named Teresa, who'd lived in the neighborhood over a decade, revealed she'd once been asked by Deborah to keep an eye on a disabled neighbor's daily routine, ostensibly for safety monitoring purposes. Looking back, Teresa realized it had likely been surveillance meant to find grounds for eventual eviction pressure. Each new story added weight to a growing, undeniable pattern. Deborah's leadership wasn't simply strict or occasionally overzealous. It was systematically built around targeting vulnerable residents, manufacturing justification through fabricated complaints, and quietly protecting whatever financial arrangement the mysterious maintenance invoices Fran had found seemed to be funding. I met with our fair housing investigator again, this time bringing Fran, Gerald, and written statements from Priya, Walt, and Teresa. The investigator seemed genuinely surprised by the scope. "This is significantly larger than a single parking incident," she said, promising to loop in the county's HOA Oversight Division formally. That same week, the Oversight Division confirmed they'd be conducting a formal financial audit of the HOA's reserve fund, specifically flagging the suspicious maintenance invoices Fran had originally uncovered. Deborah, informed of the audit through official channels, reportedly requested a brief postponement, citing personal health reasons nobody could verify. The postponement request only fueled more suspicion among residents already watching closely. "You don't delay an audit unless you're worried about what it'll find," Walt said bluntly during an informal gathering at his house, where more neighbors than ever before had started showing up to compare notes and share concerns. Sarah, meanwhile, received an unexpected call from the fair housing investigator directly. The Hendersons, the family who'd moved away 2 years earlier after their ramp was flagged, had been located and were willing to provide a formal statement about their experience, strengthening the pattern of targeted harassment even further. Hearing about the Hendersons' willingness to speak up moved Sarah more than she expected. "It's not just us anymore," she said quietly that evening. "It's years of people who felt powerless enough to just leave instead of fighting." For the first time in weeks, her exhaustion carried a thread of hope alongside it. Deborah, perhaps sensing the walls closing in, attempted one final aggressive move, sending a cease and desist letter through a hastily hired attorney, threatening legal action against Fran, Priya, and Walt for defamation, based on their public statements at recent meetings, a move that felt more like intimidation than genuine legal strategy. Our own contact at the Fair Housing Office reviewed the letter and reassured everyone that documented. Factual statements made during official HOA meetings were generally protected, especially when corroborated by video evidence and multiple independent witnesses. Still, the letter succeeded in rattling a few nerves within our small, determined group. Fran, undeterred, forwarded the cease and desist letter directly to the county oversight investigator handling the financial audit, noting the timing coincided suspiciously with her own discovery of the suspicious invoices. "If anything," the investigator later told Fran, "this letter makes your credibility stronger, not weaker, given how it reads." Meanwhile, Priya's daughter compiled the growing folder of evidence into a clean, organized timeline document, complete with dates, screenshots, video links, and witness statements from Teresa, the Hendersons, Gerald, and others willing to go on record. It read less like neighborhood gossip and more like a formal investigative case file. I shared portions of that document with a local news reporter who covered consumer and housing issues, cautious about overstating our case but hopeful that public attention might accelerate the slow county process. The reporter seemed genuinely interested, especially after reviewing the video of the attempted tow and Deborah's own recorded words. The reporter reached out to Deborah for comment, and her response, forwarded to me later by a sympathetic contact, dismissed the entire situation as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a few disgruntled residents. It was the same narrative she'd used before, though it landed differently now against mounting documented evidence. Sensing the reporter's involvement raised the stakes considerably, Deborah requested an emergency closed-door board session, attempting to push through a motion removing Fran and Gerald from the board entirely, citing conduct unbecoming a board member for their cooperation with the ongoing county investigation into her own leadership. Gerald, calm despite the pressure, pointed out that removing board members required a documented resident vote under the HOA's actual bylaws, not a unilateral board decision. Deborah's attempt stalled immediately, exposing once again how much of her authority had relied on nobody ever actually checking the underlying rules against her claims. The failed removal attempt became the final straw for several previously neutral board members. Two more, quietly uncomfortable with Deborah's mounting pattern of behavior, reached out to Fran privately, offering to support a formal vote of no confidence at the next scheduled meeting, a move that would have seemed unthinkable months earlier. Word of the brewing no-confidence vote spread through the neighborhood quickly, energizing residents who'd stayed quiet out of fear for years. Even some of Deborah's earlier online defenders quietly deleted their previous posts, unwilling to be publicly associated with her leadership as the situation continued unraveling in increasingly public fashion. Deborah, cornered but not finished, shifted tactics once more, this time focusing her energy specifically back on Sarah, perhaps recognizing that the original wheelchair van incident remained the most emotionally resonant piece of the entire unfolding story, one that had first captured neighbors' attention months earlier. A new notice appeared, citing an obscure clause requiring annual recertification of all accessible parking designations, demanding Sarah resubmit medical documentation within 72 hours or risk permanent spot forfeiture, an unusually aggressive and narrow deadline that felt designed specifically to be impossible to meet in time. Sarah's neurologist's office, when contacted, explained that formal documentation requests typically took at least 2 weeks to process properly, especially for administrative purposes unrelated to actual medical necessity. The 72-hour deadline wasn't just aggressive. It was functionally designed to guarantee failure regardless of Sarah's genuine, long-standing eligibility. I called the fair housing investigator immediately, describing the new deadline as blatant retaliation timed precisely around the growing no-confidence vote and financial audit. She agreed entirely, noting that targeting a disabled resident's parking access this way, especially amid an active investigation, significantly strengthened our case rather than weakening it. Sarah, though visibly rattled by the aggressive deadline, refused to let it break her resolve. "She wants me scrambling and scared," she said. "I'm not giving her that." Instead, she calmly documented every step of her attempt to comply, creating a clear record of good faith effort against an impossible, deliberately unreasonable timeline. Fran discovered the annual recertification clause Deborah cited had, like the earlier bylaw amendment, never actually gone through proper resident approval either. It appeared Deborah had simply been inventing rules as needed, relying on nobody bothering to check the HOA's actual governing documents against her ever-shifting claims of authority. With Fran's confirmation in hand, I sent a detailed letter to the HOA management company, county investigator, and our fair housing contact simultaneously, outlining the fabricated clause, the impossible deadline, and the clear pattern of retaliation timed directly around Deborah's own mounting legal and financial troubles within the community. The county investigator responded within a day, an unusually fast turnaround that suggested growing institutional concern. She informed us that, given the pattern of documented retaliation, the office would be issuing a formal cease order preventing any further accessibility-related enforcement action from Deborah pending full investigation completion. Receiving that cease order felt like the first real, tangible protection Sarah had gotten in months. She read it 3 times, quietly, before finally exhaling something that looked like genuine relief. "It's just paper," she said. "But it's paper with actual teeth behind it." Finally, after everything we've been through, Deborah, upon receiving her own copy of the cease order, reportedly stormed into the HOA management office demanding an explanation, insisting the county had no jurisdiction over private community governance. The office manager, tired of months of similar outbursts, simply forwarded the entire exchange directly to the county investigator's file. Cornered on nearly every front, Deborah's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She began showing up uninvited at residents' doors late in the evening, attempting to personally lobby against the upcoming no-confidence vote, her usual polished composure replaced by something more desperate, more transparently anxious than anyone had seen from her before. Teresa reported that Deborah showed up at her house around 9 at night, uninvited, pleading her case for nearly 20 minutes on the porch. "She kept saying I owed her loyalty for past favors," Teresa said, "though I couldn't think of a single actual favor she'd ever done for me." Walt's nephew, the sheriff's deputy, mentioned during another casual family conversation that Deborah's name had come up informally in connection with a separate, unrelated complaint about aggressive confrontations with residents outside typical HOA hours, suggesting her behavior was drawing attention beyond just our own documented situation. Sensing mounting pressure from every direction, Deborah attempted something drastic, quietly transferring signing authority over the HOA's reserve fund account to a name none of the current board members recognized, a move Fran only discovered by accident while reviewing routine bank statements during her ongoing informal investigation. Fran immediately flagged the unauthorized transfer attempt to both the county oversight investigator and our attorney contact, recognizing it as a potential attempt to move funds beyond easy reach before the formal audit could examine the account closely. The timing, once again, felt anything but coincidental given everything else unfolding simultaneously. The county investigator, alarmed by the attempted signing authority transfer, escalated the matter significantly, involving the district attorney's office given the potential financial impropriety angle now layered onto the existing fair housing and retaliation concerns already under active review within 2 separate government departments simultaneously. Deborah, apparently sensing the walls closing in completely, made her most reckless move yet. Late one night, our home security camera captured her parked across the street, watching our house for nearly 40 minutes before finally driving away. An unsettling escalation from bureaucratic harassment into something far more personal and unnerving. Sarah watched the footage the next morning, her hands trembling slightly for the first time throughout this entire ordeal. "This isn't about parking anymore," she said quietly. "This feels like she's genuinely losing control." I filed a police report immediately, attaching the time-stamped footage as documentation of the incident. The responding officer, reviewing the footage, recognized Deborah's vehicle immediately from an earlier unrelated report Walt's nephew had mentioned. "We've actually had a couple of calls about her lately," he admitted carefully, though he couldn't share specifics. It confirmed our growing suspicion that her erratic behavior extended well beyond just our family. Fran called that same afternoon, her voice tense. She'd discovered something else buried in older financial records, payments to a landscaping company that, according to public business records, had actually dissolved nearly 3 years earlier, meaning those invoices weren't just questionable. They were provably fraudulent from the very start. The dissolved company detail landed like another piece finally clicking into place. Deborah hadn't just been retaliating against disabled residents out of pure control issues. She'd apparently been funneling HOA reserve funds toward a shell arrangement, using the chaos of parking disputes and community distraction to keep anyone from looking too closely. I forwarded the dissolved company records immediately to the district attorney's office contact, who confirmed they'd now be formally incorporating potential fraud charges into their broader investigation, separate from but connected to the ongoing fair housing retaliation case already building steadily against Deborah's documented pattern of behavior. Sensing the investigation's scope expanding rapidly beyond her control, Deborah's public behavior grew increasingly defensive and paranoid. At the next scheduled board meeting, she accused unnamed outside agitators of orchestrating a coordinated campaign against her, refusing to acknowledge any of the specific, documented evidence multiple residents had painstakingly compiled. Gerald, usually reserved, finally spoke bluntly during that meeting. "Deborah, nobody orchestrated anything. You did this to yourself. One bad decision at a time, and now it's simply catching up with you." The room fell into an uncomfortable, heavy silence, nobody quite ready to fill the space after such a direct statement. The no-confidence vote, originally scheduled for the following week, got moved up after several board members insisted the situation had become too urgent to delay further. Deborah, informed of the earlier date, reportedly attempted to resign preemptively, hoping to avoid the formal humiliation of an official board removal vote entirely. Fran and Gerald, however, insisted the vote proceed regardless of any last-minute resignation attempt, arguing that a formal record of removal, rather than a quiet resignation, mattered significantly for the ongoing county and district attorney investigations still actively building their respective cases against her. The board convened the vote as scheduled, and despite Deborah's earlier resignation attempt, the motion passed unanimously among every member except Deborah herself, formally stripping her of the HOA presidency after nearly 3 years of increasingly unchecked authority within a community that had trusted her leadership far longer than it should have. Sarah attended that meeting, sitting quietly near the front as the vote was read aloud. When the final tally was announced, she didn't cheer or celebrate loudly, just closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled slowly, months of accumulated tension finally releasing in one long, quiet breath of relief. Deborah stood abruptly after the vote, gathering her things without a word, her usual composed exit replaced by something visibly shaken and hurried. As she passed our row, she paused just long enough to say, quietly, "This isn't over," before continuing out the door into the parking lot alone. Whatever she meant by that parting statement, the following weeks made clear the county and district attorney's investigations were far from finished either. Financial auditors arrived to formally review HOA records, this time with full board cooperation instead of the obstruction Deborah had maintained throughout her tenure as president. The audit confirmed what Fran had already suspected. Over $60,000 in reserve fund payments routed to the dissolved landscaping company over 3 years,
alongside several smaller, similarly questionable transactions that had gone unnoticed simply because nobody with real oversight had ever bothered to check closely before.
Sarah's own fair housing complaint, meanwhile, moved forward with newfound momentum, the investigator citing an unusually well-documented and corroborated pattern of retaliation against multiple disabled residents over several years, including the Hendersons, whose formal statement had arrived just days after Deborah's board removal became official. I received a call informing me the district attorney's office was formally pursuing fraud and embezzlement charges related to the dissolved company invoices, separate from any potential civil liability tied to the fair housing violations. Two entirely different legal fronts, both converging on the same person's increasingly indefensible decisions. Deborah, according to Walt's nephew, retained an attorney and stopped attending any HOA-related events entirely, her once constant presence around the neighborhood vanishing almost overnight. Her house, however, remained occupied, the mysterious son's car still occasionally parked outside, though notably never again in Sarah's accessible spot. Weeks passed with the investigation quietly progressing in the background, while Willow Creek Estates itself began settling into something resembling genuine normalcy for the first time in months. New interim board leadership, with Fran temporarily stepping into the president role, focused on transparency, publishing meeting minutes and financial records openly for the first time in years. Sarah resumed her piano lessons without a single interruption, her van parked confidently in its rightful spot each morning. No laminated notices, no orange stickers, no tense confrontations waiting at the curb. The simple normalcy of it, something we'd taken for granted before Deborah's tenure, felt almost unfamiliar now. Priya, Walt, Teresa, and Gerald had become close friends through the entire ordeal. An unexpected community bond forged through months of shared frustration and quiet resistance. They started an informal monthly dinner rotation, joking that Deborah had accidentally given them the strong neighborhood connection she'd always claimed to want but never actually built. The local reporter who'd initially reached out published a detailed article covering the entire saga, from the attempted tow to the financial fraud allegations, drawing significant attention from neighboring communities dealing with similarly unchecked HOA leadership. Several other residents from different neighborhoods reached out to us, recognizing disturbingly familiar patterns in their own experiences. Fran mentioned that the article's publication seemed to accelerate the district attorney's timeline considerably, public scrutiny apparently motivating faster action than months of quiet internal investigation alone had managed to achieve. Sometimes, it seemed, real accountability required both formal process and genuine public visibility working together. Sarah agreed to a brief interview herself, careful and measured despite everything she'd endured, choosing her words thoughtfully rather than letting anger dominate the conversation. "I just wanted to park my van without a fight," she told the reporter. Everything else just kept unraveling from that one simple, basic need. That quote, simple and grounded, resonated widely once the article circulated, capturing something essential about the entire situation that all the financial fraud details somehow couldn't quite articulate on their own: the fundamental unfairness of someone using bureaucratic power to make a disabled person's daily life needlessly, deliberately harder. Meanwhile, the district attorney's investigation uncovered additional details Fran hadn't found initially: a second shell arrangement, this one tied to a supposed security consulting contract, adding tens of thousands more in questionable payments to the growing total of misappropriated HOA reserve funds over the years. The scope of financial misconduct, once fully mapped out, painted a picture far larger than anyone in the neighborhood had initially imagined. What began as a single confrontation over a parking spot had unraveled into a multi-year pattern of fraud, systematically hidden behind aggressive, distracting harassment campaigns against vulnerable residents. I asked Fran, during one of our regular check-ins, whether she thought Deborah had planned this from the very beginning or simply escalated gradually as opportunities presented themselves. Fran considered it carefully before answering. I think it started small, and the more she got away with, the bolder she became. That explanation felt uncomfortably plausible, matching everything we'd pieced together. Small unchecked violations growing into fabricated complaints, growing into fraudulent invoices, growing into outright financial theft. Each step made easier by the previous one going unquestioned by neighbors too intimidated or too busy to look closely. As the investigation neared what officials described as its final stages, tension in the neighborhood shifted from anxious waiting toward something closer to anticipation. Fran mentioned that formal charges were expected within weeks, though she cautioned everyone against assuming the process would move as quickly as public interest demanded. Sarah and I spent a quiet evening reviewing everything that had happened since that first misplaced sign near our driveway, the sheer scope of it feeling almost surreal in hindsight. I never imagined a parking dispute could unravel someone's entire operation, she said, shaking her head slowly at the strangeness. Walt's nephew confirmed informally that the sheriff's office had been coordinating closely with the district attorney regarding a formal arrest, timing it carefully to align with the strongest possible evidence presentation, ensuring nothing about the case could later be challenged on procedural grounds during any eventual trial. Deborah, apparently sensing the noose tightening, made one final desperate attempt to control the narrative, posting a lengthy statement online claiming she was being unfairly persecuted by a vindictive group of neighbors and insisting all financial discrepancies were simply accounting errors rather than intentional fraud on her part. The statement, rather than generating sympathy, mostly drew ridicule from residents who'd watched the entire saga unfold firsthand. Priya commented publicly, listing out the dissolved company, the fabricated complaint, the impossible 72-hour deadline, each detail methodically dismantling Deborah's carefully constructed victim narrative piece by piece for anyone still watching. Gerald, in a rare public statement himself, wrote simply, "I served alongside Deborah for 2 years. What happened wasn't persecution. It was accountability, long overdue, finally catching up with decisions she made entirely on her own." The comment received significant support from residents who'd stayed quiet for far too long, with formal charges reportedly imminent. Sarah and I found ourselves oddly nervous despite months of hoping for exactly this outcome. "It's strange," she admitted, "wanting something for so long, and then feeling almost anxious once it's actually about to happen. I understood completely, having felt the same unsettled anticipation myself." Fran called late one evening with an update. The district attorney's office had finalized their case, formally charging Deborah with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and fair housing retaliation, with an arrest scheduled discreetly to avoid any risk of evidence tampering or flight before the process could proceed properly. The news, once we processed it fully, brought a strange mixture of relief and lingering disbelief. After months of fighting through bureaucracy, fear, and quiet neighborhood intimidation, formal legal consequences finally felt tangible rather than theoretical. An actual conclusion approaching after everything our small community had endured together. Sarah spent that night unusually quiet, staring out at our driveway where her van sat peacefully, undisturbed, in its rightful accessible spot. "I keep thinking about the Hendersons," she said eventually, "and everyone else who left before this ever got this far. I wish they could see this too." I reminded her that the Hendersons' formal statement had actually been crucial to strengthening the entire case, meaning they had, in their own way, already contributed meaningfully to whatever consequences were now finally arriving, even if they weren't physically present to witness the resolution unfolding in the neighborhood they'd once fled. Priya organized a small, informal gathering at her house, inviting everyone who'd contributed to the months-long effort: Fran, Gerald, Walt, Teresa, and a few other residents who'd quietly shared their own experiences along the way. It wasn't a celebration exactly, more a shared moment of collective, exhausted relief. Walt raised a toast that evening, simple and heartfelt. "To finally speaking up," he said, "even when it felt easier to stay quiet." Everyone raised their glasses, the weight of months of accumulated tension finally settling into something lighter, something closer to genuine hope for the neighborhood's future. Fran mentioned during the gathering that the interim board, now operating with full transparency, planned to formally reinstate a properly documented accessible parking policy at the next official meeting, ensuring nothing similar could happen again without a clear, resident-approved process protecting vulnerable neighbors going forward permanently. Sarah offered to help draft the new policy herself, drawing on months of research into ADA compliance and fair housing law she'd accumulated defending her own rights. "If I have to become an expert in this," she said, half joking, "I might as well make sure nobody else has to go through what we did." The following days passed with a strange, unfamiliar calm settling over Willow Creek Estates, neighbors greeting each other more openly than they had in years. The quiet suspicion and fear that once defined the community slowly giving way to something resembling genuine trust rebuilding itself, one small interaction at a time. I noticed Deborah's house remained quiet throughout this stretch. Curtains drawn, no visitors, the once constant presence of her small dog on evening walks conspicuously absent. Whatever preparation she was making for the impending arrest, she was making it privately, away from the neighborhood she'd spent years trying so hard to control. Walt's nephew confirmed the arrest date had been finalized, though details remained confidential until the operation actually occurred. Standard procedure to avoid any complications. Still, knowing an actual date existed made everything feel suddenly, undeniably real after months of investigation, waiting, and quiet, persistent effort from everyone involved. Sarah and I decided not to specifically watch for the moment itself, agreeing that chasing that kind of closure felt unnecessary given everything we'd already been through together. "We know it's coming," she said. "That's enough. Firsthand to feel like this is finally over." Fran, however, called us the moment she heard official confirmation through her own contacts, unable to contain her relief after months of quiet, careful work pulling records and connecting dots that ultimately built the foundation for everything that followed. "It happened," she said simply. "It's really, finally happened." According to Walt's nephew, who'd been present in a supporting capacity, Deputies arrived at Deborah's home early that morning, calm and procedural, without incident or drama. She was informed of the charges, the fraud, the embezzlement, the fair housing retaliation, and placed under arrest without resistance or further public confrontation. The son's car, the same one that had occupied Sarah's accessible spot months earlier, remained parked outside the house throughout the arrest. An oddly fitting, almost poetic detail given everything that had unfolded since that very first violation notice appeared near our driveway all those months ago. News of the arrest spread through the neighborhood within hours. Not through dramatic announcements but through quiet, steady text messages between neighbors who'd shared this exhausting journey together. Nobody celebrated loudly in public, but there was a palpable, collective sense of something finally, genuinely settling into place. Sarah received the news from Priya first, sitting quietly at our kitchen table when the message arrived. She read it twice, set her phone down gently, and simply said, "Okay," before finally allowing herself a small, tired smile, months of accumulated tension visibly easing from her shoulders for the first time. I asked her how she felt, genuinely curious given everything we'd navigated together. "Relieved," she said, "but also a little sad that it took all this just to park my van without being harassed. It shouldn't have needed to become this big to get something so basic and simple." That sentiment stayed with me over the following days. A reminder that beneath every headline-worthy fraud charge and dramatic arrest, the core issue had always remained. Painfully simple, a disabled woman's basic right to accessible parking, buried beneath layers of unchecked power, fear, and institutional neglect for far too long. The formal arraignment, scheduled weeks later, confirmed the full scope of charges against Deborah: fraud, embezzlement exceeding $100,000 combined across both shell arrangements, and fair housing retaliation affecting multiple documented residents over several years of unchecked HOA leadership within our own small community. Sarah and I attended the arraignment together, sitting quietly in the gallery alongside Fran, Priya, Walt, Gerald, and Teresa, a united presence representing everyone who'd contributed to finally bringing this pattern of behavior into full public accountability after years of quiet, individual suffering scattered across the neighborhood. Deborah appeared noticeably different from the confident, commanding figure who'd once dominated HOA meetings, her posture smaller, her expression guarded, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the gallery, including us, as the formal charges were read aloud in careful, methodical legal language for the courtroom record. The judge set a trial date and outlined bail conditions, including a formal order prohibiting Deborah from any HOA-related activity or contact with Willow Creek Estates residents pending trial, a legal boundary finally enforcing what months of neighborhood effort alone had struggled to achieve consistently before. Outside the courthouse afterward, our small group stood together quietly, nobody quite sure what to say after months of building toward exactly this moment. Fran finally broke the silence. "It's not over yet," she said, "but it's a real start. A real, undeniable start toward actual accountability." Sarah squeezed my hand as we walked back to the car, her expression somewhere between exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. "I keep thinking about how small this all started," she said. "One sign near our driveway. I never imagined it would end here, in an actual courtroom, months later. In the weeks following the arraignment, The interim board formally adopted the new accessible parking policy Sarah had helped draft, requiring documented resident votes for any future accessibility-related changes, closing the exact loophole Deborah had exploited unchecked for years across multiple residents' documented experiences within the community. Fran, still serving as interim president, mentioned during a community meeting that the reserve fund, once fully audited and recovered where possible, would be redirected toward genuine deferred maintenance projects the neighborhood had needed for years, finally addressed properly instead of quietly diverted elsewhere. Priya's daughter, who'd helped organize the evidence months earlier, mentioned she was considering studying housing law after witnessing firsthand how documentation, persistence, and community cooperation could genuinely hold unchecked power accountable, even within something as seemingly small and mundane as neighborhood association governance. As the trial date approached, Sarah and I found ourselves settling into a strange new rhythm, life gradually returning to something resembling normal despite the looming legal proceedings still ahead. Her piano students came and went without incident, her van parked confidently, unremarkably, in its rightful spot every single day. One afternoon, while reviewing evidence timelines with Fran ahead of the upcoming trial, we discovered something neither of us had noticed before. Buried in an old email thread, Deborah's original justification for reassigning our accessible spot had cited a resident complaint dated 3 days before Sarah had even mentioned parking to anyone outside our home. The timeline discrepancy meant the fabricated complaint predated any actual interaction between us and Deborah regarding parking concerns at all, confirming what we'd long suspected, but never definitively proven. She hadn't been reacting to some genuine grievance. She'd been actively planning this specific confrontation before it ever technically began. Fran forwarded this new timeline detail directly to the prosecuting attorney's office, strengthening the premeditation angle of the fair housing retaliation charges significantly. This isn't impulsive misconduct, the prosecutor later told us. This is calculated behavior, planned in advance, which matters considerably for sentencing considerations down the line. Sarah absorbed this new information quietly, processing what it meant that we hadn't even been randomly selected out of frustration, but rather deliberately targeted from the very beginning for reasons that still weren't entirely clear beyond Deborah's apparent pattern of choosing disabled residents specifically as convenient, less defended targets. I asked Fran if she'd ever uncovered exactly why Deborah seemed to specifically target disabled residents across multiple documented cases. Fran considered it carefully before answering. I think she assumed disabled residents would be too tired, too busy managing their own challenges, to fight back effectively. She miscalculated badly with Sarah. That theory, uncomfortable as it was, matched everything we'd witnessed. The Hendersons who'd simply moved away rather than fight. The veteran with the service dog who'd sold his house quietly. Each previous target choosing exit over exhausting confrontation. Until Sarah, with our combined persistence, finally broke that pattern entirely. Sarah, hearing Fran's theory, sat quietly for a long moment before responding. She picked the wrong family this time, she said, a quiet steel in her voice that had carried us through every confrontation over the past several months.
I wasn't going to just disappear quietly.
As the trial approached, local news coverage intensified, the story resonating with disability advocacy groups across the state who reached out requesting interviews, hoping to highlight the broader pattern of HOA overreach against disabled residents that Sarah's case had inadvertently brought into much wider public visibility and awareness. Sarah agreed to speak with one advocacy organization specifically, careful to keep the focus on systemic issues rather than personal vindication. "This happens more than people realize," she told them. HOAs have enormous unchecked power sometimes, and disabled residents are often the easiest targets because fighting back takes energy we don't always have. The advocacy organization began compiling similar cases from other states, discovering disturbingly familiar patterns of accessible parking violations, fabricated complaints, and retaliatory fines, targeting disabled homeowners across multiple different communities, suggesting Deborah's specific tactics weren't unique invention but rather a recognizable, troubling pattern repeated elsewhere too. That broader context somehow made our own specific ordeal feel both smaller and larger simultaneously. Smaller in that it wasn't some uniquely cruel anomaly. Larger in recognizing how many other families likely faced similar situations without ever finding the specific combination of documentation, community support, and persistence needed to fight back successfully. Fran mentioned that the district attorney's office had grown increasingly confident heading into trial, given the sheer volume of corroborating evidence, financial records, timeline discrepancies, witness statements, and video footage all pointing consistently toward the same clear, well-documented pattern of deliberate fraud and retaliation. Sarah spent the final weeks before trial reviewing her own testimony carefully with the prosecuting attorney, determined to present everything clearly and factually rather than letting understandable anger dominate her account. "I want the facts to speak loudest," she told me. "Not just my frustration, even though I have plenty of that too." The morning the trial began, our small group gathered outside the courthouse once more, this time joined by the Hendersons, who'd traveled back specifically to testify in person about their own experience years earlier, finally given the opportunity to formally hold Deborah accountable for what had driven them away originally. Meeting the Hendersons in person for the first time felt strangely emotional. Two families brought together by shared circumstance years apart, both ultimately choosing to speak up rather than stay silent, even if that choice had come at very different points along their respective, difficult journeys. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution methodically presented the timeline, beginning with the fabricated complaint predating any actual parking dispute, moving through the dissolved landscaping company invoices, the Shell security consulting contract, and finally the documented pattern of retaliation against Sarah. The Hendersons, Priya, Walt, Fran, and Gerald, Sarah's testimony, when her turn came, remained steady and clear despite the pressure of the courtroom setting, walking through the timeline of events from that very first misplaced sign to the attempted tow, the impossible 72-hour deadline, and everything that followed in careful, methodical, factual detail throughout her account. The defense attempted to characterize the entire situation as legitimate HOA governance disputes rather than deliberate fraud or targeted retaliation. But the sheer volume of corroborating documentation, financial records, and witness testimony made that framing increasingly difficult to sustain convincingly as the trial proceeded over several demanding days. Fran testified about the missing signature on the original complaint, the retroactively applied bylaw changes, and the unauthorized fund transfer attempt, methodically dismantling any narrative suggesting Deborah's actions had been anything other than deliberate, calculated, and consistently self-serving throughout her multi-year tenure as HOA president. The Hendersons' testimony added crucial historical context, establishing that Deborah's pattern of targeting disabled residents predated Sarah's own experience by years, undermining any suggestion that our situation represented an isolated incident rather than a sustained, repeated strategy employed against multiple vulnerable families over an extended period. By the trial's final days, even Deborah's own defense seemed to be shifting strategy, moving from outright denial toward arguments for reduced sentencing based on her previous community service record. An argument that landed poorly given the courtroom had just spent days reviewing exactly how that service had actually been conducted. The jury deliberated for just under 2 days before returning with their verdict, finding Deborah guilty on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and fair housing retaliation, the culmination of months of documentation, courage, and persistent community effort finally translating into formal, undeniable legal accountability within the courtroom. Sarah gripped my hand tightly as the verdict was read aloud, her breath catching slightly at the word guilty, repeated across multiple counts. Months of exhaustion, fear, and quiet determination finally arrived at this singular, concrete moment, something tangible after everything that had felt frustratingly abstract for so long. Deborah's expression remained largely unreadable as the verdict was announced, though her shoulders visibly slumped slightly with each additional guilty count read into the courtroom record. The commanding presence she'd once wielded so confidently over Willow Creek Estates now reduced to quiet, defeated stillness beside her attorney. Sentencing was scheduled for several weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare formal statements, including victim impact statements from Sarah, the Hendersons, and other affected residents who'd experienced Deborah's targeted harassment across her multi-year tenure as an unchecked, increasingly corrupt community leader. Sarah spent considerable time drafting her victim impact statement, wanting to convey not just the specific incidents but the broader emotional toll of feeling unwelcome, surveilled, and targeted within her own home, a place that should have represented safety and stability rather than constant, exhausting vigilance and fear. At the sentencing hearing, Sarah read her statement aloud, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. "I didn't ask for a fight," she said. "I asked to park my van in peace. Everything after that was her choice, not mine. And now she has to live with those choices." The judge, visibly moved by the cumulative testimony from Sarah, the Hendersons, and other affected residents, handed down a sentence including significant prison time alongside mandatory restitution for the misappropriated HOA funds, along with a permanent prohibition against Deborah ever serving in any homeowners association leadership role again. Hearing the restitution order specifically felt meaningful to Fran and the interim board, knowing the recovered funds could finally support genuine community improvements rather than remaining lost to whatever shell arrangements Deborah had constructed over her years of unchecked financial control within Willow Creek Estates. As Deborah was led out of the courtroom following sentencing, she glanced briefly toward our row one final time, her expression difficult to read, somewhere between resentment and resignation, before disappearing through the side door without another word spoken to anyone who'd spent months building the case against her. The lingering mystery of who exactly filed that first fabricated complaint against us, if it hadn't been an actual resident, finally resolved during sentencing when prosecutors revealed Deborah had used her deceased predecessor's old HOA login credentials to submit it, disguising her own involvement behind a name nobody would think to question. Learning this final detail landed with a strange, quiet weight, confirming just how deliberately Methodically, Deborah had constructed every layer of this scheme, down to specifically choosing a name that carried built-in credibility and sympathy within the community, ensuring nobody would suspect the true, calculating source behind it. Sarah absorbed this last twist quietly, shaking her head slowly. She really thought of everything, she said. Except the possibility that we'd actually fight back instead of just quietly accepting it and moving away like everyone before us apparently did for years without real consequence. Outside the courthouse after sentencing, our extended group of neighbors, now genuine friends after everything shared together, stood together one final time. The formal legal process finally concluded after months of persistent effort, documentation, and hard-won collective courage against unchecked, deliberately weaponized bureaucratic power. Walt, ever the steady presence throughout this entire ordeal, offered a final thought as everyone prepared to head home. "It took all of us," he said. "Nobody could have done this alone." That's probably the real lesson buried under everything else that happened these past several months together. Fran agreed, adding that the interim board's commitment to genuine transparency moving forward represented perhaps the most lasting, meaningful outcome of the entire ordeal. A structural change ensuring future leadership couldn't easily replicate the specific vulnerabilities Deborah had so deliberately exploited for her own benefit over the years. Sarah and I drove home quietly that evening, the weight of months finally settling into something resembling genuine closure. Our van sat waiting in its rightful, undisputed spot as we pulled into the driveway, an unremarkable, mundane sight that somehow now carried significant, hard-earned meaning after everything we'd endured together. In the weeks following sentencing, Willow Creek Estates continued settling into its new, more transparent rhythm, Fran's interim leadership gradually building genuine trust. Through open communication, documented decisions, and consistent follow-through on the specific promises made throughout this long, difficult community-wide ordeal together. The advocacy organization Sarah had spoken with earlier published a broader report referencing our case specifically, using it as a documented example within a larger push for stronger state-level protections against HOA overreach targeting disabled homeowners, ensuring our experience contributed toward meaningful, lasting policy conversations beyond just our own neighborhood. Sarah mentioned feeling a quiet sense of purpose from that broader impact, something she hadn't expected when this all began with a simple, misplaced sign near our driveway months earlier. "I never wanted to become some kind of advocate," she said, "but I'm glad something good came out of all this difficulty." The Hendersons, having testified and finally received acknowledgement for what they'd endured years earlier, mentioned considering a return visit to the neighborhood someday, though they'd since built a comfortable life elsewhere. "It's nice knowing the truth finally came out," they told Sarah during a brief, heartfelt phone call afterward. Priya's daughter began her housing law studies that fall, crediting the entire experience with genuinely shaping her career direction toward advocacy work, hoping to help other families navigate similarly unjust situations with the same combination of documentation, persistence, and community support that had ultimately worked for our own family. Gerald and Teresa remained active within the newly transparent HOA structure, both eventually running for formal board positions themselves, determined to ensure the community never again drifted toward the kind of unchecked, concentrated authority that had allowed Deborah's years-long pattern of harassment and fraud to go unnoticed for so long. Months later, Sarah's accessible parking spot remained simply, unremarkably hers. No notices, No confrontations. No lingering anxiety each morning before backing her van out for another day of piano lessons. The mundane normalcy of it still occasionally struck her as remarkable, given everything required to finally secure something so basic. I often thought back to that first tense afternoon. The tow truck idling at the curb. Deborah's confident smile from her porch, certain nobody would challenge her. That single overreached moment, meant to intimidate one family into silence, had instead unraveled years of carefully hidden fraud and systematic harassment entirely. Fran, still leading the board with genuine transparency, mentioned during a community gathering that the recovered restitution funds had finally allowed the long-overdue drainage, repairs and playground renovations the neighborhood had needed for years. Tangible, visible improvements funded ironically by the very fraud that had once threatened to go undiscovered. Sarah and I hosted a small dinner that spring, inviting Fran, Priya, Walt, Gerald, Teresa, and Priya's daughter, a genuine celebration of the community bonds forged through months of shared difficulty. Strange, Sarah said, raising her glass. That fighting for something so basic brought us all this much closer together. As the evening wound down, Walt raised one final toast, echoing sentiments from months earlier. To neighbors who finally spoke up, he said, and to a community that chose accountability over silence, even when silence would have been so much easier for every single one of us involved. Looking back now, the entire ordeal taught me something simple yet profound about unchecked power within small, seemingly mundane spaces like neighborhood associations, how easily fear and isolation allow small abuses to compound into something far larger, and how genuine community, once finally mobilized, can dismantle even deeply entrenched injustice. Sarah still parks her van in that same accessible spot every morning. Unremarkable now in the best possible way. Simply part of an ordinary life rebuilt on her own terms, free from intimidation, surrounded by neighbors who chose, eventually, to stand beside her rather than look away. Deborah Voss, once the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek Estates, now serves her sentence far from any HOA board meeting, her name a quiet cautionary tale among neighborhoods everywhere about what happens when ordinary people finally decide that enough is enough, and choose to fight back together instead of standing alone. The END.